Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. Thumbelina. By Hans Christian Andersen. Tiny Thumbelina is another name for Thumbelina, a character from Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale. In this tale, a young girl encounters marriage-minded toads, cockafers, and moles in the woods. Despite the fact that it was first published in 1835, no one knows when this wonderful narrative was created. There was a woman who was unable to bear children. She was desperate for a daughter, but she had no idea where or how to look for one. As a result, she sought assistance from a witch one day. In exchange for a flower pot, the witch handed her a grain of barleycorn from the farmer's field. "I'd really like to have a baby, can you point me in the right direction?" According to the fairy, it was a simple matter to deal with. The barleycorn you'll find in farmers' fields isn't the same variety as the one the hens consume, so put it in a flower pot and see what happens. When she returned home, the delighted woman planted the grain. A magnificent flower began to bloom at that very time. She couldn't tell for sure what kind of flower it was because the buds were still unopened. When the woman kissed the flower, it opened out like magic. A tulip sat in the center of it, with a young girl perched on its green velvet stamens. She was the size of a thumb when I first saw her. When Thumbelina was born, the woman named her after it. Thumbelina seemed to be settling in well to her new surroundings. Her cradle was a lacquered walnut shell, and her pillows and blankets were violet and rose petals. When she wasn't at school, she played on the table, where a plate of water was set down and a tulip petal was dropped in to float. On it, Thumbelina took pleasure in the pleasures of rowing, and often sang. This woman had a stunning voice. An unsightly toad sprang from the shattered glass of the window one night as she slept soundly in her lovely bed. Thumbelina was sleeping under a rose petal when a disgusting, large, and damp creature jumped on the table. Thumbelina was sleeping in a walnut shell when the toad grabbed it and climbed out of the window. She was ecstatic when she learned that she had managed to match her son up with a suitable match. They resided in a murky swamp with their mother, a toad. When he realized how adorable Thumbelina was, he broke out in hysterics. In order to avoid waking Mom, his mother instructed him to keep quiet. The toad was frightened that his son's prospective bride would run away because she was so small and frail that they would not even notice her if she escaped their attention. It was determined that she would be placed on a large leaf of water lily in the middle of the river while they prepared the room for her under the mud. It's here that Thumbelina and her future husband, the toad's son, plan to make their home and start a family. "If you speak too loudly," the toad warned, "she'll be awakened and she's as light as a swan's down. To keep her safe, we'll set her on a water lily leaf out in the stream. It will be like an island to her, since she's so light and small. We'll also make haste to construct the stateroom under the marsh, in which you'll dwell after you get married." Old Toad located the farthest and largest water lily leaf among a sea of them. Thumbelina was left there by her as she swam up to it with a walnut shell. When the little girl first awoke, she spent some time staring out her window at the lake. She began to weep since she was surrounded by water and couldn't get to dry land. Because there was nothing but water on either side of the enormous green leaf, and no way to reach land, the tiny little creature awoke at an ungodly hour and broke down in tears as she realized where she was. The old toad was cleaning up the room at that time. After swimming to the water lily with her son, she took her daughter's cradle and carried it into the ceremonial chamber. Thumbelina was left alone on the shore when she was informed that she would be marrying her son, and the two of them swam back to shore. It was all her son could say, and so the toad scooped up the exquisite little bed and swam away with it, leaving Tiny all by herself on the green leaf, where she grieved. There was a sudden appearance of fish swimming around the water lily's leaves. Beautiful Thumbelina was crying in front of them. Sorry, they didn't want this beautiful little girl to end up with an ugly toad. They were so sorry. With their fangs, they ripped the stem of the water lily, allowing Thumbelina to flee from the frog and her ugly son. "No, it's not going to happen," he screams. In order to reach to the root, they gathered around and gnawed away at a green stem that held the leaf on which the small girl stood. Tiny was then carried away by the leaf, which floated down the stream. For so long, Thumbelina has been out on the open seas. She traveled through numerous towns and cities, drawing the attention of birds who were enamored with her beauty. A white butterfly landed on a water lily leaf one day. It was stunning. Long did it circle around her, admiring the young girl. To speed things up, Thumbelina removed her girdle and tied one end around the butterfly, while the other ended around the leaf. After that, a massive cockchafer emerged, grabbed Thumbelina, and flew her up into the tree with him. Thumbelina, who was so small, was terrified. Tiny was terrified when the cockchafer accompanied her to the tree. She felt particularly bad for the delicate white butterfly she had tethered to the leaf, for he would starve to death if he couldn't free himself in time. But the cockchafer was quite unconcerned about it. The cockchafer was awestruck by her lustrous features. Others came to visit her after he fed her some flower honey. One of the juvenile cockchafers was plainly envious and made fun of her lack of wings and 2 legs. Eventually, all the cockchafers raised their feelers and cried out, "She has only 2 legs. How horrible it appears to be," another said, "She's got no sense of touch. Her torso is remarkably streamlined. Wow, she's just like a real person." Despite his admiration for her, the cockchafer came to the same conclusion as everyone around him. He decided to let her go because he no longer wanted her. He climbed down from the tree and left her there alone. Thumbelina sat and cried, thinking that even a cockchafer didn't want her since she was so unattractive. For most of the summer, Thumbelina spent her time in the woods alone. Sweet flower juice and dewdrops from the morning mist were all she had to keep her going. Winter has arrived, and it's going to be a long one. Thumbelina tried to keep warm by covering herself in a leaf, but that didn't work. When she got to the edge of the woods, she discovered the door of a field mouse's house, which was warm and well stocked with grain. Thumbelina, poor thing, knocked on the door with trepidation, like a beggar. It had been 2 days since the mouse had eaten anything, so she invited her to join her at the table when she opened. She was warmly welcomed inside by an elderly field mouse, who fed her and kept her warm. She wanted her to stay with her all winter because she liked her so much. To make amends, she was required to do household chores and entertain guests at her house. Thumbelina happily agreed to everything and expressed her gratitude for the opportunity to stay. One day, a field mouse said, "We'll have a visitor shortly. I get a visit from my neighbor once a week. He has a nicer apartment than I do, and he's dressed elegantly in a black velvet coat. You'd be well off as a couple if he'd agree to be your spouse. Tell him some of your best stories because he is blind." Getting married to an elderly mole was the last thing Thumbelina wanted to do. Although he was intelligent and well-read, the sun and lovely flowers bothered him. The only thing he ever said about them was negative, even though he had never met them. As she sung songs about flowers and animals, Thumbelina captured his heart. But he was a gentleman and didn't want to say anything. In order for them to come and see him on a regular basis, he built a new corridor from his house to theirs. They stumbled upon a dead swallow as they made their way through the dark and tiny corridors. The bird succumbed to the cold and died. Thumbelina was devastated, as she had a deep affection for birds. Because they have nothing save their chirping, the mole laments that his children will not suffer the same fate as that bird. With his crooked legs, the mole muttered, "He will sing no more now. There's nothing more depressing than being a tiny bird. It is a blessing that none of my children will ever be birds, for they can do nothing but squawk, twitter, tweet, and die of starvation in the winter." The mouse and Thumbelina both agreed with these smart remarks, and they stood silently next to each other. Because she had listened to the song of a dead swallow during the summer, she kissed him on the head and thanked him for all of his songs as they made their way forward. It was when she was kneeling on the ground that she reached down and smoothed away some feathers that had gathered around the bird's head and kissed its closed eyes. "In the summer, perhaps this was the one who sang to me so sweetly," she murmured, "and how much pleasure it brought me, you wonderful, beautiful bird." Thumbelina couldn't sleep that night after the mole brought her and the mouse to his den. When she awoke from her sleep, she got out of bed, made a warm blanket, and brought it to the dead swallow. She put a blanket over it to keep the bird warm as it lay on the chilly ground under her. She murmured her goodbyes to the bird, resting her head on his chest for a brief while. She was startled to hear the bird's heart pounding in its chest and sprang in amazement. The swallow had been frozen but was now beginning to thaw out. Thumbelina came to visit the swallow the following night, encasing it in a blanket to keep him warm. The bird's eyes were barely open when it saw its savior. "Swallow, I'm feeling much better now, thanks to you, pretty little maiden. I'll be able to fly around again in the bright sunshine in no time." Thumbelina nursed the swallow all winter long, and the mouse and the mole were completely unaware of her actions. That's not something they'd like. When spring arrived, the swallow was ready to fly. Thumbelina declined to accompany her, despite his requests. She decided to stay since she feared that the old mouse would be lonely without her. It seemed as if the swallow had vanished, and the little girl remained dejected. As a child, she was forbidden from going outside because the grain had grown so much that it resembled a dense forest. Tiny's eyes welled up with tears as she watched him. She had a special place in her heart for the little swallow. Tiny was overcome with sadness as the bird sang tweet, tweet before taking flight into the lush forest. She couldn't even leave the house in the pleasant weather. In the field above the field dwelling, Mouse's the corn that had been seeded had grown to incredible heights, and Tiny, who was just an inch tall, had walked through it like it was a thick forest. To help Thumbelina out, a mouse told her that she needed to spend the summer sowing a dowry since the elderly mole had requested her hand in marriage. For the poor girl, a spindle was all she had to work with, and for the mouse, 4 more spiders worked all night long to knit and weave. The elderly mole would visit Thumbelina every night and say that he would marry her once the summer was through. This made Thumbelina miserable because the mole was completely uninterested in her. Away from the house, she sat on the doorstep every day. She sat back in her chair and listened to the wind rustle the trees. Despite her best efforts, her pal never returned to show her how to swallow. Whenever the sun rose or set, she would crawl out of the house and gaze at the blue sky, wishing she could see her beloved swallow once more, as the wind swept away the ears of corn so she could see it. In fact, he never returned, as he had long since migrated to a lush green forest. The dowry was ready by the time October arrived. 4 weeks after the mouse predicted she would marry, she did so. It was heartbreaking to hear Thumbelina sob as she expressed her reluctance to wed the mole due to his wealth and the chance this presented for her. As a result, the big day had finally arrived. Because he dislikes light, the mole sought out the bride to bury her deep down. Because she had to say goodbye to the pleasant sun, the poor girl was in tears. She wept as she stood in the doorway. After saying her goodbyes to the sun and holding out her arm towards it, she traveled the short distance from the home to the fields, where the corn had been cut and just the dry stubble remained. When she finished, she wrapped her arm around a small red blossom that grew near her. In the event that you encounter the little swallow again, please say hello to him on my behalf. She was startled by a noise coming from the sky above. In the distance, she noticed a swallow fly by. She talked to him about her upcoming nuptials and her dislike of the stodgy mole. She didn't want to give up nature and the sun in order to live underground. The swallow then urged her to join him as he flew to warmer climes to avoid the approaching winter. It's always summer there, the light shines brighter, and the flowers are more beautiful, he explained to her. Thumbelina accepted and sat on the bird's back with a smile on her face. She slid into the bird's feathers and threw her head out to see the wonderful locations they flew over, despite the cold. They eventually made their way to warmer climes. Temperatures were double what they had been in her previous home because of the sun's blazing intensity. She noticed her first lemons and oranges, as well as an abundance of gorgeous grapes and vines. The swallow continued to soar till it came to rest in front of his house. His home was above a vine. He offered to set Thumbelina down so she might make a new home amid the lovely flowers, but she declined. The girl agreed enthusiastically. Beautiful white flowers sprouted from the fissures in a big marble pillar. A small man in the center of a flower astonished Thumbelina. He had a stunning golden crown and transparent wings across his shoulders. He looked absolutely magnificent. He was a floral angel that towered above Thumbelina. A tiny man or woman lived in each of these blossoms, and he was the absolute ruler of them all. Tiny said, "Oh, how lovely he is," to the swallow. The prince was initially startled by the bird, which appeared to be a gigantic monster compared to him. However, Tiny charmed him and he proclaimed her the most beautiful young girl he had ever seen. Then Thumbelina had the young monarch remove his crown and place it on her head. His question was simple: would you like to marry me and rule over all the flowers? Thumbelina nodded enthusiastically in agreement. Gifts were exchanged amongst men and women from all around the world. Thumbelina was given a pair of translucent wings as a present, which she wore on her back. All of them were in a good mood, and the swallow was singing its heart out for them all. The swallow was both thrilled and sad since he liked Thumbelina so much and he didn't want to say goodbye. Thumbelina's name was changed to Maya by the small monarch, and she was now able to soar from flower to bloom. The spirit of the flowers told her, "You must no longer be named Tiny. Despite the fact that you're so beautiful, your name is awful. Maya will be your new nickname." Swallow bid farewell to her longtime companion and set out for warmer climes. A man who spun fairy stories had a mansion built for him above his window when he returned to Denmark. As the swallow sang to the man, the entire story was derived from that song. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.